Good morning, everybody.
Okay, so we are just about ready to begin chapter 12, and chapter 12 is really the beginning of the culmination of the book, in the sense that this is the book of the Beinuni. It's the name of the book is the book of the intermediary, and now chapter 12 begins with I guess painting the picture of what the Beinuni's life looks like. So just a quick review. We had the first 8 chapters that discussed the two souls and what the souls possess. In other words, what's the makeup of a soul? The soul has both 10 sphira, 10 attributes, and also garments of thought, speech, and action, and there are 2 souls. And then we discussed chapter 9 is the battle between the two. 10 is about the righteous, the person who really has no battle because they transformed the animal soul. The person has no negative impulses. There's 2 categories within the righteous. And then we spoke about chapter 12. Chapter 11 was about the 2 categories within the wicked. What is the wicked? Wicked was the wrong word, as we discussed last week, perhaps. But wicked, the Rasha, is someone who the negative, the animal soul with a negative impulse expresses itself in the person's thought, speech, and action, in the person's garments. And now we get to the Beinuni. What's the Beinuni? The Beinuni is intermediary. How is he intermediary? You're either, by a simple definition of righteous and wicked, you're either righteous or wicked. You're either majority good or majority bad. How do you get to the point where you're middle? What is the middle here? So this is the big idea of the Tanya. The big idea of the Tanya is the Beinuni, the intermediary person. On one hand, he's not righteous. Why isn't he righteous? Because the righteous person has no negative impulse, no desire to do evil, no desire to do anything destructive. That's the tzaddik. The Beinuni, the intermediary, is certainly not a tzaddik. On the other hand, the intermediary person is not classified as a wicked. He's not classified as a Rasha, who within the life of the Rasha, the animal soul, sometimes takes control over the thought, speech, and action. When it comes to the Beinuni, when it comes to the intermediary person, he is in complete control over the garments of the thought, speech, and action. So if you look at the inside, if you look at the 10 sphirot, if you look at the emotional life of this person has negativity, and that's why he's not righteous. If you look at the action of this person, but not just the action, but really all the garments, thought, speech, and action, then the person is the Beinuni. And the person, so then the person is only the godly soul is in control over the thought, speech, and action. So that's the big idea. Now, how does this Beinuni do this? How do you do this? How are you in complete control over your thought, speech, and action if you have the animal soul with its negative impulses? If you're completely righteous and you have no negative impulses, so we understand how why your thought, speech, and action is only the domain of the godly soul. Only the godly soul expresses itself in your thought, speech, and action, because that's the only impulse you have. But if the Beinuni also has the impulse of the animal soul, how is it possible that the godly soul is in complete control over the thought, speech, and action? And here, Rabbi Shneur Zalman tells us 2 things. I'll start with the first one, which is more obvious, and then we'll get to the second one. The first thing that's more obvious, it's more obvious in the Tanya, but it's also counterintuitive. The big idea that Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying, and this is the first tool, if you think about it, in some sense, up till now, we have description. We describe the 2 souls, that's the diagnose, and we're also categorizing what type of, the battle and the result of the battle. But what is the tool for me to become a Beinuni? What is the tool that Rabbi Shneur Zalman is offering? So throughout the book, Rabbi Shneur Zalman offers many tools. But the first tool of how to become a Beinuni, which is in chapter 12, the first tool is something that a person actually, in some sense, does not have to create because you already have it. You don't have to learn how to do this. You have to apply it, but the skill you already have. And what is what Rabbi Shneur Zalman say? Rabbi Shneur Zalman says that naturally, the mind controls the heart. Naturally, a human being has impulse control. There's no question. And you don't have to practice that. You have that. The question is where and when you apply it, right? That's affected by cultural norms and other things. But the bottom line is that when somebody, if for whatever reason, if you decide this is unacceptable behavior, you won't do it, right? So for example, There's certain things you will do in your home, you won't do it in the street. I don't know. What's an example? Let's say, not that you should do this at home either, but let's say you want to scold your child. You want to tell your child, give them some rebuke. You're not going to do it in the store. You're not going to do it in front of other people. But all of a sudden, but in your home, you may do it. If you're out and about and you think nobody's around you and you're telling your child, it's terrible, you're not behaving the way you should, because he's very angry at the child at that point, all of a sudden you see somebody else. All of a sudden you'll stop in a second, in an instant. What happened? You went to therapy to learn how to control your impulses? No. Naturally, a person has impulse control. Naturally, the mind tells you this is not a good idea to do it. Naturally, you're not going to do it. Now, you have to now decide that you want to employ this skill. Okay, so that's a decision that the Beinuni could make. But the first tool, whereas the mind controls the heart, you have the ability to do something, even though your heart doesn't want you to do so, or your heart wants you to do something else. That is premise number one. In the language of the Tanya, it's Moyach Shalit al Halev. The mind controls the heart. Now, we're not used to thinking of it this way. We think that the heart is more powerful, but that's not the case. That's the big lie. That's not the case. The case is that if for whatever reason your mind tells you don't do this right now, you have the ability not to do it. The question is if you're motivated to do that, but that's a separate question. So that's the first point. The first point, again, two big points we said so far. Number one, the Beinuni is intermediary, not because of his inner life. His inner life actually resembles more of the Rasha, because the inner life, there is two souls battling. There's positive impulses coming from the godly soul, and there's negative and destructive impulses coming from the animal soul. And that's okay, and the person can't change it. And you shouldn't try to change it. That's the reality of the Beinuni. But he's intermediary because when it comes to thought, speech, and action, this Beinuni does not secede control. He doesn't give over control to the animal soul. How does he do that? Well, number one, he does so by using the innate ability of the mind to control the heart. That's point number one. Now I'm going to say one or two more points, and then we'll take questions, and then we'll read the Tanya inside, because this chapter is a beautiful chapter and spelled out very well, much better than I can do it. What's the next point? The next point is, yes, I have the ability to control my thought, speech, and action. The ability, yes, but not necessarily the motivation. So what gives the Beinuni the motivation to do so? So here Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, remember I told you that the Beinuni can control his emotion? That's true for the whole day, for most of the day. But there are unique times when the Beinuni could awaken within his heart that he should only feel the love of the godly soul, the love to holiness and the love to God. When is that? That's the time of prayer. Time of prayer, he gives some Kabbalistic terminology of how it works and why it works, but time of prayer is the time of divine awareness, and the Beinuni, through prayer, through meditation, could create, not for the full day, but momentarily. In other words, during prayer, through meditation, a person can create a feeling of love to God. That feeling then motivates the person that for the rest of the day, even when he does not sense the love of God, he still has the commitment and the resolve to be the Beinuni, to not give control of his thought, speech, and action to the animal soul, only to the godly soul alone. So that's the next point. The next point is what prayer does for the life of the Beinuni. Now, prayer is prayer, but you can also think about it in a broader level, in a broader way. A person is not a computer. In other words, a person is not just the person has to have a reason for them to go to this battle and not give control to the animal soul and keep control over the thought, speech, and action. Why am I doing so? So in that sense, the experience of Judaism has to be a positive one. In other words, I have to have positive emotional experiences that motivate me to want to be in control for the rest of the day. And what is that? That's prayer. But for other things, it could be other positive experiences. But that is the big idea. So in other words, if I feel a love to you, then in my life I'm not going to want to do something that offends you, even if it takes self-control. But if I don't sense the love once in a while, then why would I engage in the self-control? Because I'm afraid of what? I'm afraid of a punishment. Okay, that's very superficial. So that's the second big point. The second big point is the way the Beinuni is able to control the thought, speech, and action. So how it's possible to be done, it's because of the innate human nature. Human nature, a person could control his himself, and a person does have inhibitions. A person is able to control not their emotional response, but whether or not that is going to lead them to an action. So I could be very upset at you, right? I could be so angry at you. Take a question in a second, Karina. Let me just highlight this point. I could be so upset at you, right? You know, what's the big lie? The big lie is, I had no choice. You made me so angry, so I scream at you. You made me so angry, so I hit you. I had no choice. What am I going to do? I was so angry. And it's your fault, of course, you made me so angry. Okay, so that's a fallacy. How do I know it's a fallacy? Because when somebody who's bigger than me and stronger than me makes me so angry, I don't get up and hit them because I say it's not going to be a good idea. Even though my emotions want me to, but I don't. Why? Because my mind tells me bad idea. And maybe I scream at my child when they get me upset, but I'm not going to scream at my boss. Why not? Because my mind tells me terrible idea, bad idea, don't do it. So the mind does control the heart. That's the fact. The question is, when do we tap into that? When are we motivated to tap into that? Well, that's our decision. Okay, so these are the two big ideas. There's one more idea that we're just going to highlight what we said in earlier weeks. But before that, Karina, please go ahead.
Okay. No, just I wanted to share a thought about what you've just said, because I think it's important, this last part about doing it because we want to, or we understand, we love to do it, because if not, it sounds like a very repressive system, you know, like very repressive, because we are human. So I think this last part, at least it makes sense to me, like it, you know, like I feel it like, yes, I think this is important.
I agree with you. I'll ask you a question, because I was just talking to somebody about this today, and because I listened to someone who taught a Tanya class without naming names, and he didn't really focus on that part of the chapter. And then I basically put the question to myself: could you be a Beinuni without awakening the love occasionally? And I think the answer is no. In other words, theoretically, every moment I could control myself. At any given moment, if I look at this specific moment, I can control myself. But the question is, over time, what would be the motivation? Could I cultivate that motivation? Because it takes effort. And what would be the motivation for the effort? Ultimately, I need a motivation. And the motivation is that at certain times, I sense the love of God. I sense the love of the godly soul. I sense that this is the person I want to be. And because I feel it, that's why even when I don't feel it, I say, look, this is the person I want to be. This is what I'm going to do. Right? So I think it's true in any relationship where there's going to be some degree of self-control necessary. Right? So if I'm committed to you, by definition, I have to say no to other things and other experiences. Well, if my whole life is about saying no, I'm not going to be able to say no. I'm going to ultimately succumb to temptation, perhaps, even though theoretically I could, but it's very, very hard. But if I sense the commitment to you and I sense the love to you, then the self-control is, first of all, doable and easier, and it becomes part of a positive experience. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I would take it even one step further. What you said, it's certainly true, but even one-time control requires desire to do good, and that's impossible without education and without knowledge of God.
Correct, but even with the education, the question is it impossible without a love, without emotional feeling? In other words, I know what the right thing to do is, but I have no emotional motivation to do so. I want the negative, the destructive behavior is much more enjoyable, much more pleasurable. So I'm not drawn emotionally to the positive decision, but I know what the positive decision is. The question is, could I control my thought, speech, and action? And the answer is yes. A person couldn't control their impulses. There's no question a person can. And if I don't, it's because I gave up control. There's no such thing as you got me so upset, so I had to scream, or I had to shout, or I had to paint the walls, spray paint the walls red. It is no such thing, right? The thing is, the thing I could say, the temptation made me emotionally uncomfortable, so I decided to give in to my impulse. That, yes, that you could say. But to say that it's not a decision, no, it's always a decision. Why? Because, like I said, sometimes, even though I want to do something, I'll never do it. Because I realize my mind tells me it's not in your best interest, right? So I could control. If I could control, that means when I don't control, it means that it was a decision not to. Conscious or subconscious, but it was a decision not to. So at any time, if I have the knowledge, if I have the knowledge, I could control my thought, speech, and action. The question becomes, over time, could I live this lifestyle? Could I, with no emotional connection to you, over time, again and again and again, win the battle and say, I'm in control of my thought, speech, and action, not my animal soul? That is something that, according, at least what the Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying here, at least the way it sounds over here, it's very unlikely I'll be able to do so. And that's why we're not just concerned for the Beinuni, and that's why for the rest of the book, we're not just concerned with the thought, speech, and action, because we tell the Beinuni, you can do that. It's not a problem. You can control your thought, speech, and action. What's the problem? We now, from here till the end of the book, we also want to help the Beinuni cultivate a love to God for two reasons. Technical reason is because that's what Moses says. The book is based on the Tanya, the book is based on the verse in the Torah, as we said in the first class, where the verse says, the matter of serving God, the matter is close to you, beficha in your mouth, bilvavcha in your heart, to do it. So Judaism is easy to implement in your heart as well. That's what Moshe says. That's the pitch. How is that easy? Like Rabbi Shneur Zalman says in chapter 17, it's not easy. It's hard to love God. Okay, so we'll teach you how to do it because Moshe says it could be done. So that's one reason why the book is ultimately going to shift to the emotional state of the person as well. But here we're saying even before that, it's possible that in order for you to be a Beinuni, to be able to control thought, speech, and action, in other words, to use thought, speech, and action exclusively for the domain of the godly soul, that takes a tremendous amount of commitment and a decision to hold on to your control. It seems like from this chapter that you're going to need some motivation. And the motivation is to love to God. But our Beinuni doesn't love God. He doesn't love God all the time because he has the animal soul. But occasionally he can love God. When is that? Specifically through prayer, the time of prayer. Now, you can pray formal prayer, informal prayer, but the bottom line is a person's going to have to cultivate a desire and feel the desire of the godly soul to be motivated to keep the control in the hands of the godly soul. Because otherwise, what's the motivation for this self-control, which is required? But I agree with your point, which you began with saying that a person needs education. A person has to know what's right and wrong. Yes, I agree with that. Finally, the end of the chapter, Rabbi Shneur Zalman reiterates the point that we said earlier, that this doesn't mean that the Beinuni is not going to have a negative thought, because the negative thoughts are going to fall into my mind as a result of the animal soul. The animal soul throws negative thoughts into my mind. But he's going to describe what we described last week, how the conscious decision to continue thinking about this negative thought, once I'm self-aware and I realize that it's a negative thought, that the Beinuni has the chance to stop, because it's a garment and you could change your garments, as we discussed earlier. So this is the big idea of chapter 12. It continues, it's the culmination of the first 11 chapters. It's really the culmination. And remember, we're coming from the perspective of the people coming to Rabbi Shneur Zalman, and they're saying, we are conflicted because we have a problem, because we look at ourselves and we can't figure out if we are we good people? Are we bad people? We're doing the right thing, but we harbor destructive desires. So what does that tell us about ourselves? What does that tell us about our state of spirituality? So here comes the big relief. The big relief is that's okay. You have two souls. And the fact that your animal soul has destructive desires, and negative desires, that does not mean that your godly soul is not intact. So that's a tremendous relief. What's the word I'm looking for? But the call to action of the book, in other words, the other side, after the relief, now it comes, okay, now the hard work of the book, what the book tells you can read, this is the life you can lead, is that you could control your thought, speech, and action. And you can have that your thought, speech, and action should be the exclusive domain of the godly soul. It takes work, but it could be done. How could it be done? Comes chapter 12 and says, well, first of all, it's a natural thing. If for whatever reason your brain tells you that don't control yourself, you will control yourself, right? You have to be motivated to control yourself. But if you need to, you could control. A person has complete control over their thought, speech, and action. Even though it's counterintuitive, we don't really think we do. But if we analyze it, we realize we do. Okay, but is that enough just to self-control? No, you have to motivate the self-control. What's motivation of self-control? You have to feel the love of God. When do you feel the love of God? I'm a Beinuni. I have a struggle within myself. Yeah, but during prayer, it's possible for the animal soul to go to sleep. It's going to wake up after prayer, but don't worry. After prayer, you already have what he calls the reshimu, the mark, the ray, the mark of the love. When you experience the love, that even after when the love subsides, but that the residue of the love will continue and motivate you throughout the day. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Ken.
Can you say that the godly soul resides in the brain and the animal soul in the heart?
Yeah, so that's what he said in chapter 9. In chapter 9, he said that they both have both. The animal soul has emotion and intelligence, and the godly soul as well. But he said the primary place of the godly soul is the mind. And from the mind, it goes to the heart. And with the animal soul, it's the opposite. The primary space is the heart, and then it goes to the mind. In other words, the animal soul also has a mind. But what's the job of the animal soul? The job of the animal soul is, it's primarily emotion. The question for the animal soul is, how do I feel? And then if I decide that this thing makes me feel good, so the mind is going to help me get my goals. So in other words, who's serving who? In the realm of the animal soul, the mind is serving the heart. In the realm of the godly soul is objective. It's not about me, it's about the greater truth. I want to connect to the greater oneness. So it's not about how I feel. So it starts with the mind. The mind is the tool a human being has to be objective. And then once I understand that this is what I want to do, okay, so it trickles down to the heart. So yes, the godly soul is more intellectual and the animal soul is more emotional, if you want to generalize, even though and this is a big idea of Tanya, they're both a complete personality. They both have 10 sefirot. So both the godly soul and the animal soul have both, they both have the 10 sefirot, which means they have intelligence and emotion. So they're both a full personality, but the question is, within that full personality, which element of the personality is more dominant? And that's what he said in chapter 9, exactly what you just said here.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to try to read it, treat it with Tanya inside. It's a very beautiful chapter, I think. And any questions, please don't hesitate to jump in. You don't have to wait till the end. So I'm going to share the screen with the lessons of Tanya. Again, we're not going to read the shaded boxes. We're just going to try to make it through. It's a relatively long chapter, but it's not complicated. It's straightforward, I think. Okay, here we go. Chapter 12. Finally, we get, after discussing 11 chapters, figuring out everything else we need to know, we get to the beginning. Veha Beinuni, and the Beinuni. Okay, now we're going to define the Beinuni. What's the intermediate man? Is he in whom the evil of the animal soul never attains enough power to conquer the small city. Small city is the body. So as to clothe itself in the body and make it sin. That is to say, the three garments of the animal soul, namely thought, speech, and action, originating in the kalipa, skipping the paragraph, the bracket, do not prevail within him over the divine soul to the extent of clothing themselves in the body. Neither in the brain, nor in the mouth, nor in any of the other 248 organs. I'm skipping, to cause them to sin and to defile them, God forbid. Only the three garments of the divine soul, they alone manifest themselves in the body, these being the thought, speech, and action related to the 613 commandments of the Torah. And now comes a very powerful statement, which we have to explain. The Beinuni has never committed any transgression, nor will he ever transgress. The name Rasha had never been applied to him, however temporarily, not even for a moment throughout his life. This is very surprising. To be a Beinuni, according to what we just read, a Beinuni not only will never sin, has never sinned. Okay, so does that mean that I'm out of the race because I once sinned? So here, you need to study the Tanya with the commentary and all the commentary that was passed on, and what the Rebbe said about it. Others say it doesn't mean you never did it, so you never sinned. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, that can't be the meaning. What we're saying is as follows. What we're saying is, in the state of mind that I am in right now, in that state of mind, I don't harbor any possibility or any desire to concede my thought, speech, and action to the animal soul. So when it says I never sin and I never will sin, how do I know I'll never sin? I don't know what the future will bring. What it means, in the state of mind that I am right now, there's no sin. There's no sin means that there's no control of the animal soul and thought, speech, and action. So that's the meaning here. Now, if I'm such a great guy that my animal soul never takes control of my thought, speech, and action, so why am I not a righteous person? Well, the answer is because that's only thought, speech, and action. That's only the garments. The garments are external. If you look within me, my godly soul is not the only the only force that rests within my heart. I also have the animal soul with its desire, and there's the battle. So that's why, regarding the garments are in complete control of the animal soul, but not regarding what's happening within myself. And then here's where Rabbi Shneur Zalman continues. However, the essence and being of the divine soul, in contrast to the garments, the essence and being of the divine soul, which are the 10 faculties, do not hold undisputed sovereignty and sway over the small city. In other words, it's not undisputed. There's another sovereign disputing, except only at specific times. I'm only reading the bold way so we can get by quicker. Such as during the recital of the Shema or the Amidah. At this time of prayer, the supernal intellect above is in a sublime state. So this is a Kabbalistic idea that within the 10 divine sfirot, during prayer is a time when the divine sfirot of intelligence are dominant and available. So there's more awareness of God that a person can access in the world during the time of prayer. So therefore, that's above, and likewise below in the physical world, the time of prayer is propitious, if that's a word, for every man to ascend to a higher spiritual level. Then, during the recital of Shema, during prayer, the Beinuni binds his Chabad, his intellectual faculties, consisting of Chachma Bin Adat, to God, meditating deeply on the greatness of the Blessed Ein Sof, and arousing through his meditation a burning love of God in the right part of the heart. It's explained in the previous chapters. Meditation on God's greatness arouses the love of him within one's heart. This love in turn leads the Beinuni to desire to cleave to him by means of fulfilling the Torah and its commandments out of love. This arousal of love for God and its accompanying resolve to adhere to Torah and mitzvot and thereby to cleave to him is the essential subject of the Shema, which the biblical commandment enjoins us to recite. So you have the Shema. What's the theme of the Shema? The theme of the Shema is love the Lord your God. First of all, meditate. Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, God is one. That's meditating on God, divine greatness. That gets you to love the Lord your God. You should love the Lord your God. And right after that, it says, these words which I command you today shall be upon your heart, and you should speak of them and ultimately put them on your heart, the tefillin and the study of Torah. It's basically telling you, you meditate on the greatness of God, you have the emotional love to God, and that brings you the resolve to live in your thought, speech, and action consistent with the divine will. So that's the blessing, that's the Shema. Before the Shema, we also have blessings, and after the Shema, we have blessings which are rabbinic. The purpose of those blessings here, he says, is to help us create that love to God when we recite the Shema. So it's more preparation. Likewise, the rabbinically ordained blessings preceding and following the Shema are in preparation, enabling us to fulfill that which we recite in the Shema as explained elsewhere. Okay, so what happens when a person is praying? When a person is praying, at that time, at such time during the Shema or prayer, when the love of God burns in the heart of the Beinuni, the evil in the left part of the heart, the animal soul's principal area of manifestation, is subjected to and is nullified before the goodness, i.e. the love for God, that spreads into the right part of the heart, where the divine soul is manifest from the Chabad faculties in the brain, which are bound in meditation to the greatness of the Blessed Ein Sof. What's happening here is like this. During prayer, my mind is connected to the greatness of God. That flows down to my heart. I have an emotion. And when that happens, the left side, which is the emotion of the animal soul, is subjugated and is not felt at the time. But that's only because I'm actively thinking about and awakening my love for the infinite light of God. But after prayer, why am I going back to the question, why am I a Beinuni if I'm so perfect, if I have my thoughts, speech, and action are in complete control of my godly soul, and when I pray, I can love God, everything is fine. What the problem is, but this state of affairs lasts only for the duration of the spiritually charged time of prayer. However, after prayer, when the state of sublimity of the intellect of the Ein Sof, blessed be he, departs. In other words, this is spiritually, we're going to the Kabbalah, that the time of the divine awareness is less, it passes. And the same thing is within the person stops meditating about the greatness of God, i.e. when the spiritual illumination engendered by prayer ceases, the evil of the animal soul in the left part of the heart reawakens. And he, the Beinuni, once again feels the desire for the lusts of this world and its delights. Yet, because the evil of the animal soul has not the sole authority and dominion over the city, it is unable to implement this desire by clothing itself from the limbs of the body, indeed speech and action, and indeed speech or actual thought, to concentrate his attention on worldly pleasures with a view to devising means of satisfying the lust of his heart. Why, after prayer, why can't the animal soul express itself in the thought, speech, and action? Because the animal soul is not the only sovereign. There's another sovereign, and there's a battle. Okay. Now, who wins the battle? Who decided that the godly soul is going to win the battle every time? And that's what we're saying right now. Because the brain rules over the heart, as it is written in the Raya Mehemna, Parshat Pinchas, which is from the Zohar, by virtue of its innately created nature. The mind can control the heart. You don't have to go to learn how to do this skill. We have that. For man was so created from birth that every person may, with the power of his will and his brain, i.e. the will created of his mind's understanding, restrain himself and control the drive of his heart's lusts, preventing his heart's desires from finding expression in deed, word, and thought. And he can, if his mind wills it, divert his attention completely from that which his heart craves and turn its attention to exactly the opposite direction. So this is natural. Now we're saying, especially if you're turning to holiness, there's a built-in advantage to holiness over unholiness, and that is the Rabbi Shneur Zalman's interpretation of a verse in Proverbs, which we're about to read. If this is true, whatever his motives, it is true particularly in the direction of holiness. Thus it is written, King Solomon says, "Then I saw that wisdom surpasses folly as light surpasses darkness." So King Solomon, the wisest of man, in Kohelet, says like this. He says, I see that there's an advantage to wisdom over foolishness, just like there's an advantage to light over darkness. Now, what does this mean? Does it mean that you need King Solomon to tell you that wisdom is superior to foolishness? Any person will tell you that. So here's the way Rabbi Shneur Zalman explains it. Rabbi Shneur Zalman explains, just like light dominates darkness, if you have a dark room and you light a candle, immediately the light will illuminate, the room becomes light. So too, the holy is able to overcome the unholiness, the foolishness. So when he says there's an advantage of the wisdom over the folly, he doesn't mean advantage. He means Yisra means an advantage, but doesn't mean that it's on a greater level, but it means it has an advantage, it's more powerful. So here he explains, this analogy means that just as light has superiority, power, and dominion over darkness, so that a little physical light banishes a great deal of darkness, which is displaced automatically and inevitably without any effort on the part of the light. The dark room, you light a candle, there's no battle. Second you light the light, the dark dissipates. So is there driven away automatically much foolishness of the klipa and sitra achra of the animal soul located in the left part of the heart. As indeed our sages say, a man does not sin unless a spirit of folly enters him. So ultimately the perspective of the animal soul is folly. Why does it get pushed away? Because by the wisdom of the divine soul that is in the brain, which desires to rule alone over the city, the body, and to pervade the entire body by means of its aforementioned three garments, namely thought, speech, and action, connected with the 613 commandments of the Torah as discussed above. So the godly soul always has control over thought, speech, and action. Why? Because you have built an advantage. The mind can control the heart. The wisdom can overcome the folly. Okay, if everything is so good, so why am I not a tzaddik? Oh, you're not a tzaddik. Why? Because your animal soul is still alive, well, and kicking, and is still pushing you to the negativity. Nevertheless, he is not deemed a tzaddik at all. For this dominance that the light of the divine soul has over the darkness and folly of the klipa, which is automatically dispelled. We said, oh, just like you turn on the light, the darkness disappears. It doesn't work that way within the soul. Putting on a light, putting on the love to God will not make the love of the animal soul disappear. It just means it has dominance in the thought, speech, and action. Is limited to the divine soul's aforementioned three garments. But the essence and core of the divine soul does not dominate in essence, the essence of and the core of the animal soul deriving from the klipa. For in the Beinuni, the essence and core of the animal soul originates in klipa, which is lodged in the left part of the soul, remains undisturbed after prayer, when the burning love of God is no longer in a revealed state in the right part of his heart. Rather, the love is after prayer only on the inside his heart, is inlaid with hidden love, meaning that love which is natural to the divine soul, as will be discussed later. So later we'll discuss the idea that there's a hidden love always within the godly soul. We're leaving that alone. What happens with the righteous person? The righteous person constantly feels the love for God, even the incomplete righteous person. And because he feels the love for God, so the animal soul is either disappear, either is transformed if he's a complete tzaddik, but even if he's not a complete tzaddik, the animal soul is not strong enough to create an active desire in the heart because it's diluted to the point it's nullified before the love of the godly soul. However, in the Beinuni, the love is not so powerful, and the Beinuni is not able to rid the animal soul, in other words, to weaken it to the point where it does not have any active negative impulses. No, the Beinuni after prayer, maybe during prayer, but after prayer, the animal soul has not been diminished. Its power is still there, and therefore we're going to describe how the animal soul pushes back. Then, after prayer, when the love of God is no longer revealed in the heart of the Beinuni, it is possible for the folly of the wicked fool, i.e., the animal soul, to reveal itself in the left part of the heart, craving all physical matters of this world, whether permitted or whether prohibited, God forbid, as though he had never prayed. Now, we're going to get into the idea that do I actually want to sin or I just want to think about sin? So it depends on my level. His craving is limited only in that, in the case of a craving for a prohibited matter, it does not enter his mind to transgress his actual practice, God forbid. But thoughts of sin, which are in certain respects, as explained in the previous chapter, more heinous than actual sin, can manage to rise to his mind and to distract him from Torah and divine service. As our sages say, there are three sins so difficult to avoid that no man is safe from transgression daily: thoughts of sin, lack of concentration of prayer, and slanderous gossip. So therefore, after prayer, my godly soul, my animal soul, is still felt and is still sending me impulses and is still distracting me. However, the impression retained in the mind from his meditation during prayer on God's greatness and the natural love and fear of God hidden in the right part of his heart enable him, we'll get to the natural hidden love that's later, to prevail over and dominate the evil animal soul's craving, preventing the evil from gaining the supremacy and dominion over the city, the body, and carrying out its craving from the potential to the actual by clothing itself in the organs of the body, in actual speech or deed. In other words, the godly soul, because of the residue of the love to God in the mind that it felt during prayer, now does not let the animal soul take control over action or over speech. Those are the easy ones. Now comes the hard one. And this is what we discussed last week. How did I know what I told you last week? Because I know what it says in this week. Furthermore, even in the mind alone, with respect to sinful thoughts, the evil has not the dominion and power to cause him, God forbid, to think thoughts consciously. And this is the definition that we said that a Beinuni controls his thoughts. You can't control which thoughts fall into your head. But i.e., what do we mean that the animal soul, that the godly soul has control of the thoughts? To cause the mind to accept willingly, God forbid, the evil thought that arises of its own accord, unbidden from the heart to the mind, as explained above. In other words, ceding control of the mind doesn't mean that a thought falls into your head. That's not what ceding control of the mind means, because naturally that's what's going to happen, especially if you have an animal soul. Ceding control means at the point where you're conscious that it's a negative thought and you willingly accept it, and you make a conscious decision to continue thinking about it, right? Instead, immediately upon the thoughts rising to his mind, he, the Beinuni, thrusts it aside, as it were, with both hands, and averts his mind from it the instant he realizes that it is an evil thought. He will refuse to accept it even as a subject for mere conscious thought I'll most certainly not entertain the notion of acting on it, God forbid, or even speaking of it. For he who willingly indulges in such thoughts is deemed a rasha at that moment, while the Beinuni is never wicked even a single moment. And now we have a beautiful example, because until now we were talking about the matters and perhaps matters between person and God. Now it's between people. So too it matters between man and his fellow man. As soon as there rises from his heart to his mind any animosity or hatred, God forbid, or jealousy, anger, or a grudge, and their like, he will bar them from his mind and will refusing even to think of them. On the contrary, his mind will prevail over and dominate the feeling of the heart to do the exact opposite of that which the heart desires, namely to conduct himself toward his fellow with the quality of kindness, as opposed to the quality of severity, where hatred and anger originate, and to display toward his fellow a disproportionate love and suffering from him to the furthest extreme, without being provoked into anger, God forbid, or to take revenge in kind, God forbid, but on the contrary, to repay offenders with favors, as taught in the Zohar, that we should learn from the example of Joseph's conduct with his brothers, when he repaid them for the suffering they brought upon him with kindness and favor. That's the conclusion of chapter 12. What is Rabbi Shneur Zalman saying? Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying that, am I a person who is never going to sense hate and jealousy? Of course I'm going to sense hate and jealousy. Why? Because I have an animal soul. The question is, as soon as the thought of hate and jealousy fall into my mind, that I have no control over, that doesn't make me that doesn't mean that I'm not a Beinuni. But as soon as I recognize it, and I recognize that this is a conscious decision, a conscious thought, and it's a damaging thought, and it's a thought that I don't want to think about, right? I have to be jealous of you. It's not productive. It's not constructive. It's not going to do anything good for me, for my life. It's not going to make me a happier person being jealous of you, okay? Or being angry at you. So as soon as I identify this, then it becomes a conscious thought. And now it's up to me whether I accept this thought or I reject it. Now you can't reject the thought. We discussed that earlier. The only way to reject the thought is to actively think about something else. And that's what the Beinuni would do. So in summary, what are we talking about? What is the Beinuni? What's this new personality and not just the personality, but we'll see later in chapter 14 in 2 weeks. The Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, what God wants of you is not to be righteous. God does not want you to be righteous. What he wants you is to be a Beinuni. He wants you to be intermediary. What is the righteous person? The righteous person is the person that can rid their soul of all negative desires and impulses. And people try to do that for a very long time, serious people. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, don't do that. That's not what God wants of you. That's not your mission in life. That's not what God wants of you. And if you try to do that, you're just going to be disappointed and frustrated. And ultimately, you're going to despair because it's impossible for most people. So in that sense, that's not what God wants of you. So what does God want of you? God wants you to experience the battle between the godly soul and animal soul and understand that regarding your thought, speech, and action, you have control. In other words, it is a conscious decision. At any moment, it's choice. I could decide how I want to respond with my thought, speech, and action. Even thought, which I can't stop the guy knocking on the door. Remember the story about the Jew knocking on the door? I think I said it. I may have said it about the JLI. If I haven't said the story of the person knocking on the door, I need to say it again. But in any case, you can't stop the thought falling into your mind, thoughts of jealousy, thoughts of anger, anything that will define as destructive thoughts. Now, we don't mean you should never be angry. Sometimes you have to be angry and protect yourself, etc. We're not talking about that. We're talking about when those thoughts are negative, right? Joseph and his brothers, at some point, he when he realized that the brothers showed remorse, at that point, there was no more, he refused to entertain and think about what they did to him. Instead, he only did kindness to them. So that at that point, it becomes a conscious choice. Okay, but how could the Beinuni do this? How could the Beinuni always be sure that in other words, the perspective of the mind, the perspective of the godly soul will dominate over will control the thought, speech, and action? We say because that's natural. Natural, a person has impulse control. We decide when we want to use it, but naturally that's what we have. So this is the tool of Mayach Shalat Halev, the mind controls the heart. That is a natural innate tool that you could deploy, the godly soul could deploy if it chooses to do so. Now, what's the motivation to choose to do so? Well, for that, I have to pray. I have to create a love to God. And then when I have the love to God, then I'm motivated, even when I don't sense the love, but I say, this is the person I want to be. This is the experience I want to have. Ultimately, the negative experience, after I have it, I regret it. It doesn't do me any good. Jealousy, hatred doesn't do me any good. So I'm now going to make the decision that this is not what I want to do. And therefore, when I make that decision not to secede control of thought, speech, and action, I'm able to do it, right? Now, there's two ways to do a Beinuni. Just want to point out before the question, two ways to do a Beinuni. One Beinuni is to say, I'm making a decision right now. I am never going to succumb ever to thought, speech, and action, negative thought, speech, and action. Some people can do that. It's a very high level. Another person you can do it is you could look minute by minute. At any minute, I have a choice. Am I going to be a Beinuni? I have a negative impulse in my heart. Fine. But now I have a choice. At this moment, will I be a Beinuni? Will I control my thought, speech, and action? We had a teacher who said he used to be a chain smoker, and then he stopped. How did he stop? He said, I never stopped smoking. I never came out with the decision and said, I'm never going to smoke again. I don't know if I can do that. What did he do? Every time he wanted to smoke a cigarette, he says, you know what? At this moment, I'm not going to smoke. Well, that he has control over. He has control over the moment. Ultimately, many moments create years and days, months, years, and decades. So that's another way to look at it. To look at it as at every moment I have a choice. Or there's a way where we say, I'm in the spiritual state. I'm in the spiritual state where I can't even entertain giving up the control because I feel so strongly about this. But even if I don't, at every moment I have the choice. At every moment I have a choice, I could be a Beinuni at this moment. And that's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to say in chapter 14. At every moment, a person could decide to be a Beinuni and to be in control over the garments, thought, speech, and action. So that is what I could do. That's what I should do. Other things to rid my soul of negativity, of negative impulses, that is not something that you could do. That is not something you should try to do. And for most people, that's not what God wants you to do. Okay, we'll take a few questions. Vicky, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi. I think you answered all of my questions after I raised my hand, but I just want to make sure. I want to make sure that I understand. It's indeed very beautiful chapter, very beautiful and very useful, especially the way you explained it. Because my first question was, sometimes even tzaddik is repulsed by klipa. And it's, for example, Joseph before. What did he feel when he was in the pit?
Oh, so very good question. Very good question. Very good question.
Tzaddik
is repulsed by klipa. Rabbi Shneur Zalman said he hates the klipa. He hates negativity. But there's a difference. So we'll get to that later. We'll get to that later in chapter 32 when it comes about loving other people. How do you deal with negative people? But the tzaddik hates evil, but he doesn't always necessarily hate the people that are evil. You can differentiate between the sin and the sinner. But again, we're talking about this is for a person where the hate is destructive. I'm no expert in mental health, but I'm sure in some cases, certainly with his abuse, this is not necessary. I don't know to what extent we have to apply this in all cases, but let's assume that in the cases where hate, jealousy, etc., the negative emotions that Rabbi Shneur Zalman describes, in the case where those things are negative, and I know they're negative, I don't entertain them.
Right, and as far as the safety for the person to repay with the good deed to something bad, it also has to be evaluated. It shouldn't be foolish, right? It has to be a spark of wisdom.
And think about Joseph. Joseph was in a position of strength where the abuser cannot continue abusing him, right? If you think about the position of Joseph, who's the second most powerful person in the world, maybe the most powerful because Pharaoh's too busy. I don't know what he was doing, but he wasn't active in the kingdom. So yes, if you're the superpower of the world and your brothers can no longer, and the abuser can no longer harm you, even if they chose to, then you're in a different position, right? If you're in a vulnerable position, that's a separate story.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Bob.
Good morning, Rabbi, and thank you. What a wonderful chapter. I just want to make sure I've gotten all this right. If Rasha is white and black, and the Chacham is white, basically what the Tanya is saying, we all live in shades of gray. Understood. Now, this is a tug of war between the animal elements and the godly elements. Understood. The Beinuni is shading towards the godly soul, I would imagine, in parlance. Now,
Should I jump in? Can I jump in or?
Yeah, please jump in to qualify, and then I have the question.
Okay, so the Beinuni. Okay, I'm hearing echoes. So I'm gonna mute you for a second if you don't mind. Okay. Oh, so the Beinuni could be a person. I ask you a question: who is the Beinuni closer to? Is he closer to a tzaddik or closer to a rasha? So there's a spectrum, as we will see. But I can easily paint the picture that a Beinuni is actually, if you look at what's happening within the heart, the Beinuni looks much closer to a rasha than to a tzaddik, because as we described last week, a rasha doesn't mean a person, there's a complete rasha, we're not that, but a rasha that has good, a non-complete rasha is somebody who has negative impulses, and those negative impulses sometimes take over the thought, speech, and action. That's all. That's what a rasha is. So most normal, good, decent, excellent people you know would be classified as rasha. Now, we dealt with last week how don't get scared away with the term, because it doesn't mean what we think it means. But that's the idea here. So I have the negative impulse in my heart, both positive and negative. But if the negative impulse takes control of my thought, speech, and action, I'm a rasha. Now, for the Beinuni, if you look inside the heart, if you take an X-ray of what's happening within the heart, it looks identical. His internal state is identical to the state of the rasha. He has the battle of the godly soul and the animal soul. He's just like the rasha. So if you take him to the X-ray, he's exactly like a rasha. If you, however, you look at the thought, speech, and action at the garments, he's exactly like a tzaddik. So that's why he's intermediary. He's intermediary because he's a different category. When you look at the inside is exactly like a rasha. The outside is exactly like a tzaddik. So it's a different category. Go ahead.
So my question now is, if yes, we have one arm, we're armed with our natural instincts in terms of mind over matter, and we have discipline. Understood. Now, why does the first tool in its toolbox go to tefillah or prayer over mitzvah? I mean, it's always na'aseh v'nishma. It's always, the Meraglim got sinned because they didn't want to, they wanted to stay in the desert and pray as opposed to integrate into the city and do.
Right.
So why are we going to tefillah before we're doing to mitzvah?
Okay, so I would say that when you say the Beinuni is in control of thought, speech, and action, that is mitzvah. He's doing the right thing. Doing the right thing includes the mitzvot, of course. And if I'm not doing a mitzvah, but I'm doing something that will serve my mitzvah doing. Right? If I'm going to work, why am I going to work? That was Tanya chapter 7. Either my work itself is a mitzvah because I'm healing people, or my work itself is a mitzvah because I'm helping people. But even if not, my work itself is the way that allows me to live in this world and ultimately do a mitzvah. So when we say thought, speech, and action is all mitzvot and everything else we do that is positive and wholesome. But the problem here is, what's going to give my inner motivation? And of all the mitzvot, the mitzvah that gives me love to God, the mitzvah to love God, which is a mitzvah, when do I cultivate that? So I could eat matzah without loving God. I could sit in the sukkah without loving God. And you could also do it with loving God. But when is the time that a person could actually create the love to God if he's not sensing it? So according to the Kabbalah and Hasidic philosophy, the good time to do so is prayer for two reasons. The spiritual, mystical reason is because that's when the divine awareness is present. But the practical reason is because that's when we think about the greatness of Hashem. You can't love something unless you're aware of it. So the ice cream has been in the freezer, so we're aware of it. It's physical. But something abstract like God, we have to make it real in our life to be able to love it. So when do you make God's presence real in your life? Through prayer, through meditation. So I would agree with you that in the Beinuni's life, his most important concern is action, is mitzvot. He wants to do the right thing. It's doing the mitzvah when I have to do the mitzvah, and doing the things that help me do a mitzvah when, in other words, the realm of the neutral, going to work, taking care of the bodily needs, et cetera, et cetera. Everything else I'll do, I'll eat, I'll drink, I'll sleep. Everything else I'm doing is serving the mitzvah. In the language of the Tanya, chapter 7, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. So that's his primary concern with action, primary concern with mitzvot. But the problem here is, because there is negative impulses, how am I going to get into my inner core and help give me the inner fortitude and inner strength to want to execute my inborn sense of, natural born sense of self-control which works when I'm motivated to control myself. When I don't scream at my boss, it's because there's a good reason not to, because then I'm going to get fired, right? When I don't punch this person, the boxer who's 7 feet tall and 300 pounds, there's a reason why, even though I want to, when I don't do it, it's because there's a good reason not to. So what's the good reason for me to want to execute, to express the power of self-control? Well, there has to be a motivation. Well, what does the motivation come from? Motivation, ultimately, the emotional motivation comes from the prayer. So, but I agree with you that in the Beinuni's life, the action is primary. He's primarily engaged in doing the right thing, in thought, speech, and action. But that includes all the mitzvot. But again, the question is, could you do this forever? Could you ultimately have self-control without having the inner motivation? And technically, the answer, I think, is yes. At every moment, you could say, at this moment, do I have the ability to execute self-control? I think the answer is yes. But over time, you need inner motivation. And that inner motivation, I think, comes from prayer. I think that's what Tanya is saying.
And, just one more point, that remember with Avraham, he was in deep discussion with Hashem in his tent and blew him off just to meet the three, three angels. So
the Beinuni will do the same. The Beinuni who loves God, if at this point there's a mitzvah to invite guests, and he knows that God wants him to invite guests, and that means the godly soul wants him to invite guests, he'll stop doing what he's doing and he'll go and run to invite the guests. So I agree. This is within the Beinuni himself. You have to make choices, right? A Beinuni that say, just like I have 2 mitzvot. Which mitzvah takes precedent? So there are laws. The mitzvah that could be done through somebody else, the mitzvah that cannot be done through somebody else. So all this is important. But I take your point, and I agree with you that the Beinuni, just like in Judaism, the action is primary importance. I think it's even more true in the Beinuni's life, because in the Beinuni, that's really the domain where he can excel at. Emotional love to God is much more tricky, and that's secondary, and that's a cause for motivation. And I have a secret to tell you, that the description of Tanya chapter 12 is very romanticized. A person could meditate and think about Hashem and awaken the love for the heart and live happily ever after. Well, I'll tell you, sometimes I try to meditate, sometimes I try to awaken the love to God, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So what Rabbi Shneir Zalman is going to do we start at chapter 16, and really all throughout the book, but especially in the chapter 40s, but in chapter 16, he basically says there's a range of feelings, more intense, less intense, that a person could develop. And there are some people who cannot ever awaken a passionate love to God in their heart the way they love something physical. Why that is another story. And he gives other paths to speak to the heart. So, like I said, chapter 12, the description of the prayer in chapter 12 is true for some people, but it's not true for everybody. The ability to awaken the love. And Rabbi Shneir Zalman is a practical person, and he understands that, and he will address that. So if you just read the chapter and everything makes sense, yeah, I understand I have self-control, but can I see myself awakening a passionate love to God in my heart every day or every time I pray? That seems a little bit harder to do. Don't worry. There's a reason why the book doesn't stop at chapter 12 and the book goes to chapter 53.
Beautiful teaser. Thank you, Rabbi.
I have to make sure you come back next week, It's a cliffhanger. Okay, wonderful week, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you all for joining. And the journey continues next week. Same time, same place, in good health.
Shabbat
Thank you,
Shalom.
Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.